Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our Academy Forum. We have a full agenda today, and so I'm very mindful of the time constraints, and so we will stick to the time slot we've agreed, and we should finish by 1:30. So for those of you I don't already know, I'm Michaela Johns, one of the directors at Hopper Williams & Bell and head up the Academies team. Our speakers today also specialise in academies, and I will let each one of them introduce themselves as they come to their slot. So I think we're nearing the end of September now, and it's audit time for some of you already. So let me just cover a few practical points before we start. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box, and we will answer them as we progress and pick any others up at the end. Your microphones and cameras are switched off, but the presenters will switch on every time they speak. And just so you all know, we will send you the slides and the recording of this next week, so you can share with your teams and your trustees if you wish. We have put a couple of interactive polls in today's seminar, and you'll see there on that slide, there's a QR code for you to scan into your phones or log it in www.slido.com and put that code in, and then you can participate in these live polls, which will come up on the screen. So that'd be great if you could do that now while we're just going through the introductions. So moving on to the agenda slide, we firstly have Lorraine, who is an external speaker from Minerva, and Lorraine has attended some of our forums in the past, and she will be covering the changes that have come in under the new Procurement Act that was coming in next month. We will then move on to Gary Brown, who will cover the main changes that came into effect from the 1st of September from the Academy Financial Handbook. James Flood will then update us on things that we need to know around internal scrutiny. And then I will cover the final sessions on governance and a brief reminder on timelines and something to start thinking about for the future, decarbonisation. So let's make a start with Lorraine.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you for the introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. I've just jumped off of a course this morning about the new Procurement Act. So I've just spent the last several hours going through all the new procurement notices. So I'm not sure if this is a break to talk about it more, but there we go. So a very warm welcome to everybody. So I'm going to be covering the Procurement Act 2023, what do you need to know? And so little agenda that we've got on the next slide. So we're going to do a little introduction. When is this happening? Some learning and development opportunities, SME and social enterprise access, the central digital platform, transparency, key changes, and some resources and Q&A. So quite a bit to rattle through there, and I've only got 25 minutes and I am going to stick to time. So if we don't get time for Q&A, then please feel free to submit your questions through the sort of chat or Q&A, and I can always come back to them and answer them afterwards. So just on the next slide, introduction and overview, and into the next one. So just before we sort of start the main sort of thrust of the presentation, just really a reminder of the thresholds that we're talking about here. So for some of you, this will be relevant because you will be tendering for contracts that are above these thresholds. But the best practice that sits alongside what I'm talking about today is really good for any procurement process. So even if you're not procuring contracts that are above these limits, then I still think there's some really good information in here that you can take into your procurement processes. So these are the thresholds that came into effect from the 1st of January 2024 and will next change. I think it's January 26 will be the next time they change, because it's every couple of years. The numbers do look a bit strange, but that's because the thresholds are quoted in euros. And even though we're not in the EU in that sense, they haven't rounded the numbers up because we're still part of the World Trade Organization, and they set all their limits in euros. So that's why there's some very strange numbers. What's very important to note with these thresholds is the little asterisk there, which is now includes VAT. So with effect from January 24, when you're calculating your values, you need to ensure that you are including VAT on those numbers. So as I say, and that is the whole life value of the contract as well. So it will be not only the initial term, so usually it's sort of 3 years as an initial term, but if you have any optional extensions, irrespective of whether you exercise those options in the end or not, you must include those optional extensions when you're calculating the value. So if you're doing something like a 3 + 1 + 1, then you must include the 5-year value of your contract. You mustn't split your contracts up into smaller values just to avoid the regulations. That's a massive no-no. It's one of the biggest things to avoid. So even if you think, well, I'll just do a 1-year contract, if you know feasibly, for example, your cleaning contract, it's not going to be a 1-year contract. You're always going to need to have a cleaning contract in place. Then, you must calculate the sort of, the rolling value of that contract. And of course, you're not likely to get best value from a contract if you're just doing it rolling on a year. You're much more likely to get a better value for money offering from your suppliers if you're offering a longer term. So lots of things to bear in mind there in terms of your thresholds and calculating those values. So just moving on to the next slide, we were just going to do a little poll here. So just in terms of the new Procurement Act that's coming in, and just really for people to vote and say, how well prepared do you feel regarding the new Procurement Act 2023? So your options are not prepared at all, partially prepared, will be ready by the time the Act comes into force, or fully prepped and ready to go. So a few options there, just give you a couple of seconds for everybody there to put their votes in. I love these polls when you can see like live what everyone's answers are. That's brilliant. Okay, so we've probably got everybody's options in there. So yeah, so that's good. It looks like most people are partially prepared and they're going to be ready by the time the Act comes into force. For those of you that are not prepared at all, fear not, there's some good news that I will come to in a moment with regards to that. So hopefully I can I'm not going to say make your day because it's procurement related, but maybe it'll be a little bit easier for you. So when is this happening is the next question, and that's where I say the good news is coming. So on the 22nd of April, it was announced that the go live date of the 28th of October is basically not going to happen now. They're not ready. The rationale given was that, even though I'm sort of arguing, you can't bury your head in the sand anymore about this, the same still applies. Even though we've now got longer to prepare for it, the fact that some of you haven't started yet and some of you sort of are almost there, we have got a little bit longer. So the reason given was that a new government means that a new National Procurement Policy Statement, NPPS, which is what the regulations are sort of underpinned by, a new one needs to be drafted for the new government because they've got different priorities. So that's the reason given for the delay. The real reason for anybody that's involved or as close to it is that they weren't ready. The Central Digital Platform, which I'll mention in a minute, no one's even seen anything in terms of testing. Some of the contract notices aren't ready yet. So there's quite a bit still to do. So what I'm actually quite pleased about is that they have actually now put it back to the 24th of February 2025. So for those of you that haven't started your prep yet, that's great news for you, because hopefully after today you'll be able to see what's available to you to get ready for this happening, and you've got a bit more time. What I'm particularly pleased about is that they've actually given it a decent length of time before the go live date. So rather than just going, oh, we'll do it in 8 weeks, which invariably never happens, they have actually given a reasonable extension. So that's really good news for everybody, particularly those that aren't quite feeling ready yet. So one of the things I would recommend, sort of my first key action maybe for people to take away today is just with regard to thinking about what contracts you've got that are renewing now or sort of in advance of the new legislation coming into force. So is there an opportunity for you to maybe re-tender those contracts before the new legislation? There are not masses of changes with the new legislation. There's quite a lot that's very similar. And in fact, you can almost run identical processes to what we do now and still be within the bounds of the new legislation. However, obviously, suppliers are very nervous about it. There's not much support for suppliers in regard to what's coming in. And so it's possible that maybe an idea is to renew some of your contracts in advance of the new legislation. Certainly, if you've got contracts that are valued at 5 million, I know that's probably only for perhaps larger mats, but there are new requirements around publications of contracts and publications of KPIs and in the new legislation. So if you can procure under the old legislation, you'll avoid those types of things. And just to be clear as well, if you start under the existing legislation, you can finish under the existing legislation. So even if your procurement actually sort of goes over the change date, if you like, if you started with the Public Contracts Regulations 2015, you can finish with that. So hopefully that's another reason. So just have a think about what contracts you've got. Is there anything that you could potentially do in advance that might be helpful to you? So moving on now to some learning and development. So just, for many of you that are saying the sort of the 2/3 of you that are saying you are prepared, then, or broadly there, I'm sure that some of this learning and development you've already done. So there's a few options available to you. What was available in February this year, which was available for everyone, and I would recommend that everybody does this. Anybody in your school or trust who might have anything to do with procurement in some way, I'd suggest doing the knowledge drops. They're 45 minutes in total, so they don't take very long to do, and it's just a really good sort of almost like scene setter for what's coming up. So I think that's handy for everybody to know. In terms of the e-learning, which is the next thing that became available, that was available in March. This is a skilled practitioner certificate. So there's 9 modules and then there's a test. They say that the modules are an hour. I would allow longer than that because they are complex. And my top tip, if you haven't done them already, is make sure you take lots and lots of notes as you go along because it is quite complex. And if you want to pass the tests at the end, there's one sort of little test on each module. Having some notes to refer back to is very, very helpful. So that's my top tip for that one. So I think anybody that is actually really involved in procurement, so is running tender exercises, particularly above threshold, I would say that sort of that skilled practitioner certificate is a must do for you. Next up from that, again, this is for sort of the experts in your school, your academy or your trust, is the Advanced Certificate of Deep Dives. So these are expert practitioners. They're 3 days sort of face-to-face with a cohort of colleagues. It could be anyone from the public sector, so not necessarily from the education sector. They could be potentially NHS, local authorities, DFE. So there's, but that's a sort of advanced certificate. So that's a real kind of deep dive into the legislation with lots of exercises to do. But the great thing about that is that obviously you'll have a cohort of people on the course with you. So always useful to have buddies that you can talk to once the legislation goes live. So and then the final support from a learning development point of view is the communities of practice. So that's an online forum that went live in May, and that's a great place for you to pop your questions, and actually ask other people what they are up to, and get some support and guidance in a more practical sense, i.e., we're using the legislation in anger now. What are people finding? What are they doing about different scenarios? So that's a really great place to hang out if you are in the procurement world. I'd not suggest it otherwise if you're not. Okay, so the training is available via the Government Commercial College. So if you pop onto the Government Commercial College website, if you're not already registered there for training that you might have done previously, then obviously please get registered, and then you can access the training from there. One thing that I just sort of very briefly touched on a moment ago is that there's very little training or information for suppliers. So this might be an issue when the legislation goes live, because for some of them, they're not really sure what's coming and how it's going to work. I think at the level that we're operating, at the level in terms of value and complexity of our contracts, it shouldn't be an issue because it's reasonably straightforward. But certainly for some suppliers where they're looking at, bidding on big government contracts, then I think it is going to be a little bit of an issue. I think there is more flexibility in the regulations. It'd be interesting to see if contracting authorities use that flexibility. And if they do use it, I think that it'll be interesting to see whether there's challenges in the courts, because of course there won't be any case law for us to rely on in these circumstances because it is new legislation. So I've got to be honest, I would not want to be the first contracting authority to do anything complex or using the new flexibilities in the legislation, because I strongly suspect they'll find themselves in court just because they're going to test the case law around it. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. So I'm glad I'm not them. So in terms of key actions to take away with regard to learning and development, I would suggest make sure that you review the learning and development offer that's available. Consider who within your school or trust needs to enrol for each level of the training. And of course, knowing how busy everybody is, do make sure that you plan time to complete that training, particularly if you're doing the the modules that, as I say, you probably need to be allowing about, I would guess, 15 hours in total to get all of that done. So, knowing how busy everybody is, it's important to plug that time into the diary. So just moving on to a little bit around some of the more interesting points, certainly for us in the education space around the sort of legislation. And the first thing is around SME and social enterprise access. So there's been a lot of talk about this right from the very beginning, where they had the sort of the green paper around how the legislation would be pulled together and what sort of things should be considered. So some of the things that I know are a bit of a bugbear for us when we're working in education is that the tender processes don't really tend to lend themselves to sort of very small SME businesses, and sometimes they're the ones that we know and love, and particularly where you've got maybe smaller schools that are joining a trust and they've got a really good local supplier who they really like. The prospect for them is quite daunting of completing a compliant sort of process under the public contracts regulations. So there has been a lot of talk around SME and social enterprise access to make these tender opportunities more accessible for SME businesses so that they can get a bigger share of the public purse. Now, the reality about this is that the way that the Act will do this is that it will require contracting authority. So you as a school or trust, an academy or a trust are the contracting authority. You're going to be required to consider SME businesses and make the opportunities more accessible. So, for example, it might be the case that you don't ask them to provide accounts or insurance at the bidding stage. It might be that you are very careful about any kind of levels of turnover or profitability that you're expecting to see from a business who's successful. So again, that helps to sort of prevent SME businesses being out of the running right from the very beginning. I think that the idea is to level the playing field, but my concern about this is how it's going to be enforced. So I can't see quite how they're going to enforce this in the regulations. And I think, again, this is probably going to come down to a challenge. The issue with the challenge is that an SME business is probably not going to have the resources available to them in order to actually make that challenge. So if you think about the minimum cost of a challenge generally through the courts is about £10,000, and there's no guarantee of success, you can imagine that most SME businesses are not going to have that time, resource or expertise in order to do that. So it's required for them to prove that the contracting authority had a failure to have regard for the SME sector, and that's incredibly difficult to prove. There's also concerns that they need to raise that challenge within 30 days of the tender going live, and at that point they don't know whether they've been successful or not. So do they take that risk right at the outset. So whilst in principle it seems like a lovely addition to the legislation, I'm not actually sure in practice how that's really going to help them. However, I have got a note on that in the next slide in a moment. The other element that comes in around, which is helpful to SME businesses, is that there will be prompt payment requirements for organisations in the supply chain. So it's going to mean that that sort of 30 days expectation of payment is going to be more enforceable. And certainly for, as we know, some of the larger organisations, their payment in terms of promptness is not always that great. So I definitely think that is one positive element that will be helpful to SME businesses, that they're not going to be required to wait 60, 90, sometimes 120 days to get payment, particularly thinking here about construction companies or subcontractors, you know, of the main contractor that are often ending up going bust because they're not getting paid. So I think that is a very positive step forward from the legislation. So that's good. Nice to see something that is positive and will have a positive effect, I think. So in terms of key actions, I think you would need to take in this regard, think about what you already do to support SME businesses in your tender processes. Make a note of this. And I think that's a key thing there. Make a note. Note taking and records are your friend when it comes to anything procurement related. If there's any kind of challenge in the process or any questions over it, being able to refer back to the notes that you've made is really critical. So I would definitely suggest that anything you do about this, even if right at the outset you say, well, these are the things that we do in relation to SME businesses, just keep a record of that in case it's challenged. And then also consider how you may need to update your tender processes to have due regard for SME businesses. So for us, for example, we're looking at references, and we've changed how the references that we receive are scored to make the scores higher if a contractor doesn't necessarily have all schools for their references. So they might be doing a fantastic, amazing job cleaning the local, I don't know, retail outlets or offices. And it might be that actually the difference between that work and what they were doing in school is negligible. So we've changed our scoring so that they're not penalised for the fact it's not in a school, because some SME businesses obviously may not have a full suite of schools or number of references in a school environment. So it's just things like that that you could just be considering. The central digital platform, moving on to that now, that is where suppliers will essentially be able to register and store all their details to use for multiple bids. Again, this is a brilliant sort of development, but I think part of the reason why the legislation's been put back because this central digital platform hasn't been fully developed yet. So, but the great thing is they can register in one place, put all their details in there, all their insurance information, all their documents, and they can use that then to bid for multiple opportunities, and all those opportunities will be in one place. So the Finder Tender Service and Contracts Finder, which Contracts Finder isn't relevant for schools and academies. You are exempt regarding Contracts Finder, but for those that aren't exempt, then all of that will be in one place. So it'll be just a lot easier from a transactional and bidding point of view, which is fantastic. So just moving on to transparency. There will be, and again, I'm not sure how this is going to work in practice. It'll be very interesting to see. There is going to be what's called a central debarment list, and that will be visible on the .gov UK website for all to see. So essentially, there will be, I won't go into the details because we quite honestly haven't got time on this session, but there will be an opportunity for bidders or contracting authorities to essentially debar suppliers due to things like poor performance. So where we've seen something like Fujitsu, where they failed to perform in relation to the post office scandal, it would be possible for them to then be put on a debarment list. And what that does is it prevents them from bidding on any public sector contracts. So the reason I'm not sure I can see how this will work in practice is that all that's going to happen here, I think, is that the lawyers will earn a lot of money, because you can imagine someone like Fujitsu who's bidding for government contracts all the time. If they're on a debarment list, that could potentially send their business under. So I'm pretty sure that the lawyers will have something to say about that. So again, be interesting to see how it works in practice. But I like the theory of being able to actually put suppliers on I'm going to call it the supplier naughty step in terms of poor performance. The other thing that's coming in with regard to transparency is measuring performance. So this, I mentioned this earlier, contracts that are valued at 5 million plus in value, the contracting authority is going to be required to publish a minimum of 3 KPIs and provide a performance report annually on those KPIs. So how is your supplier actually measuring up to those KPIs that you have published? Now, if you think about it, contracts 5 million plus, the works value is just over 5 million. So essentially, every single works contract you do that's maybe lasting any period of time, you'll be required to publish the KPIs and actually, also report on their performance. There is an exception to this, and that's the light touch regime. And so for those of you that are familiar, the light touch regime covers school catering services. So luckily, the light touch regime is exempt from the publication of the KPIs. So that's quite handy, because for many of you, that's probably the only contract you might have that goes over 5 million aside from works. So that's a good little exemption for schools and academies. The other thing that will be required is legal agreements. You will be required to publish redacted copies of your legal agreements for any contracts over £5 million. So as you can see, just those two sort of areas of transparency, i.e. enabling people to see what's going on, not only is it additional work, but also it's an opportunity that bidders may, disgruntled bidders may look at this, and particularly with legal agreements, if you're not publishing the legal agreement that you may be issued with your tender, there could be challenges around that. So hence my earlier comment about a key action, in terms of maybe that if there's any procurement you can do in advance of the new legislation coming in, it might be quite handy to do that. So key actions on transparency: consider what contracts you have which go over 5 million, review existing KPIs that you have on other contracts, think about what you'd like to report on in the future, and do bear in mind that legal agreements will also have to be published. And what does that mean for your school or trust? You know, have you got a suite of documents? Do you need to have that developed? So moving on to key changes, so sort of practical application. There are 6 procedures currently, and that is dropping down to 2. There will be just a single stage open procedure, or I love this phrase, any other competitive procedure which the contracting authority considers appropriate. So almost it's a bit of a free-for-all, which I think is what suppliers are worried about. So one thing to bear in mind with that, though, is the process must be proportionate to the nature, complexity and cost of the contract. So if you're running a tender process for an ICT managed service, for example, it would probably be excessive to have a 10-stage process with pre-supplier engagement and bidder discovery calls and presentation days and site visits and so on and so on. You need to make sure that your process is proportionate to the nature, complexity and cost of the contract. So that's a sort of key tenet that underpins what sort of procedure you will use. Flexibility, I've mentioned this earlier. There is flexibility in the new procedure, as we've just mentioned there, but where is the training and support to make the best use of this coming from? Or will we, particularly at the outset when we don't know how the legislation works and we've got no case law, I think what will happen is that everyone will just stick to what they're currently doing and probably not make any changes, and that is absolutely fine. So if you currently use something like the restricted procedure for your tender processes, or you're using a framework, you can just carry on doing the same thing. And just to note on frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems, if you're using those, if you're accessing those, it will be down to the framework or the DPS owners to make sure they're compliant. Many of the ones that are currently in existence will have end dates beyond the new legislation coming in. So it will be down to them to make sure that they procure their new frameworks and new DPS under the new legislation. So that's another good route to market, which will be compliant. So the other thing is just there's lots of changes of terminology that are coming in, but I think one of them will cause much confusion, because at the moment we've got the most economically advantageous tender, MEET, a horrible acronym. But what's happened with that is that there's been this sort of view that it's been a race to the bottom, because the most economically advantageous does sort of imply the cheapest, and bidders have sort of really got wedded to this economically advantageous low price price. So the change is that it will now become the most advantageous tender, MAT, which, as I say, will get really confusing because MATs will be looking for MAT from their tender process. But the reason for that is because what they're looking for is ensuring that we're looking for best value and not just the lowest price. So that's, it's a very small change in the wording, but it's to try to make sure that we're achieving best value. So a combination of good price, service delivery, and and that's the whole sort of best value piece. So there will be new notices. There is new documentation that's required. So moving on to a couple of slides, the assessment summary slide. The assessment summary replaces the standstill letter. There's a lot of stuff on there that I'm not going to read out, but there's lots of guidance documents available on the .gov website, which I'll mention just in a couple of slides time. So don't worry too much about making a note of everything there, but just to say that there are new notices that are going to be required, and there's a new assessment summary as well. So there are new documents that you need to be thinking about and devising some templates for. The assessment summary is no longer required to reference the relative characteristics and advantages of the winning bidder. And the other point, which is probably quite relevant for everybody, is that the standstill period will reduce from 10 calendar days to 8 working days. And whilst that doesn't seem like much of a change, it's really there to avoid some contracting authorities were deliberately issuing standstill contract award notices on late on a Friday afternoon, such that it meant that there was essentially 4 days where bidders couldn't challenge because they were weekends. Some were even going as far as doing them on bank holidays, which reduced the time even further. So to get over that, the standstill period will be 8 working days instead. So a small change, but obviously for good reasons. So some key actions that I think you could take away from this session. Make sure you familiarise yourself with the key changes in terminology. So MEET to MAT, scoring versus assessment methodologies, standstill letter versus assessment summaries. Understand all the new notices that are coming in. There will be some new ones that you'll be required to do. For example, a termination notice is a new one coming in, which whether a contract comes to a natural end or whether you terminate it early, you will be required to publish a notice on the find a tender service. So again, that's a new one that you need to be aware of. And this last bullet point is very, very quick to read, but obviously there's a lot underpinning it. You need to ensure that your systems, processes and internal documentation, so things like your internal financial regulations, are all updated to reflect the changes that are coming, because obviously you need to make sure that they are accurate. So I still see some financial regulations that make reference to overdue, and obviously we haven't had that for quite some years now. So you do need to make sure that your internal documentation and systems and everything else, how you publish your contract notices and all those different things do reflect this new legislation, which is why I think just that bullet point alone, it's great that we've got a little bit longer. So just very finally, there's a slide here and you'll get the slides afterwards, as Michaela said, just some resources there that you can go to. So if you want regular sort of newsletters, updates, webinars, then there's the Transforming Public Procurement website. There's some fantastic guidance documents. If you've got insomnia, then I can't remember how many there are now. There's probably about 40 of them, I think. And so yeah, but if you want detailed information about certain elements, then things like exemptions, how to write an assessment summary, all those different things are on that website. And Mills and Reeve are a firm of lawyers. I mean, obviously other legal firms are available, but Mills and Reeve do have a particular specialism in public sector procurement. They do a fabulous 5 in 25 webinar series, which is answering 5 questions on a particular subject in 25 minutes. They've got a great client briefing and they've got a procurement portal website. All of these links that I've given you there are full of a wealth of information. So I'm conscious of time. I knew this would happen. We've run out of time for questions, but what I would say is, as I mentioned earlier, if you do have questions, then certainly pop them in the chat and we can pick them up and I can definitely respond to them. What I would say is please don't worry about the legislation. We are only on the end of the phone or the email. So if there's anything you want to ask, then just get in touch with us and we'll be very happy to give you the benefit of any wisdom we have. We do have access ourselves to things like Achilles, which is a public sector procurement expert organisation, and obviously lawyers, etc. So, if we don't know the answers ourselves, we can certainly go off and source it from somewhere. So yes, that is my whistle-stop tour of the Procurement Act 2023 coming to an academy or trust near you on the 24th of February 2025. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine. Thank you for taking us through your slides on procurement. So I'll be following that, taking you through the Academy Trust Handbook. So my name's Gary Brown, Director here at HWB. Many of you will know me from your Academy audits or previous Academy forums that I presented at. I'll also just briefly touch on some accounting officer letters as well that we've seen of late in 2024. And then there'll just be a very short poll as well, our second poll of the day, so nothing too taxing. So you'll be pleased to hear that the Academy Trust Handbook, which was released on 31st July, there weren't too many changes to the 2024 Trust Handbook. So this Trust Handbook comes into effect from the 1st of September 2024. So we've obviously passed that date. So it's in effect now. In 23, we did see a simpler and shorter version of the handbook, and a number of changes really in 2024 have just been some very small things, some strength in the controls, and perhaps just some further simplification of the handbook. So looking at the various sections, so we've got a section on roles and responsibilities. So there's just one major change here. So the major change here really is just to focus trusts on the digital and technology standards, and just referring them to say, well, actually, your trustees, your IT staff, your senior leadership team really should be looking at these standards and just making sure that you've applied them appropriately to your trust. So these standards were first published in March 2022, and they cover areas such as non-tangible areas, so broadband, cloud solutions, cyber standards, but also tangible areas such as server laptops, network cabling, etc. So really action is just to remind your leadership teams, your IT staff and trustees that the standards are there and they need to be followed. Moving on to the section on main financial requirements, there's a couple of changes in this section. The first one was just a subtle wording change, really. It's just the wording previously read, set a policy holding reserves and explain it in its annual report. They've now just included some further wording just to say including a clear plan for managing reserves. There is a good practice guide around reserves, so if you need any guidance, that's always a good place to go to. But it's really just to make sure that you've reviewed your policy and you've got a clear plan for how you're going to administer that policy going forward. The second change in the financial requirements section is to do with electric vehicle salary sacrifice schemes. So there's been some cross-government consultations, discussions, and they've come to the conclusion that they need to pause the position on these schemes whilst they gather data on how trusts are intending to implement the scheme going forward. So previously in the 2023 Trust Handbook, it said that ESFA approval was not needed where there was no potential for obligation or liability to fall back on the trust should the employee not fulfil their obligations under the salary sacrifice scheme. They've now changed it in the 24 scheme to say that you must now seek ESFA approval for entering a new scheme or any employees entering an existing scheme. So a real tightening up there just until they clarify the position and what they're happy for trust to do. In terms of internal scrutiny, James will take you through more detail, but there's a couple of changes here really. So the first one's in 3.16 of this section, and it mainly applies to much larger trusts where the income is over 50 million. So currently, trusts can use in-house internal auditors, bought-in internal auditors, non-employed trustees, and independent review by perhaps a CFO of another trust to carry out your internal scrutiny. For trusts over 50 million, it's limited to the first two, so in-house internal auditors or bought-in internal audit functions. So that's a should at the present time, and from the 1st of September 2025, that's going to be a must. So that might apply to some of you, but I'm guessing for the bulk of the people on this call today, probably doesn't apply. But one just to keep an eye on, just in case your income is going to go over 50 million. And the second change really is in 3.17. It's kind of linked to the whole sort of ethos around sort of the changes to the Academy Trust Handbook, and going from it being a financial handbook to a trust handbook. You know, it's more encompassing than that. It's to do with governance as well. So this is really looking at who can carry out that internal scrutineer role. And previously it said that they should have a finance or audit qualification or appropriate qualification. Now it just refers to them having a relevant qualification and or experience in the area that they're actually going to be carrying out that internal scrutiny function in. So perhaps some simplification, but perhaps some broadening of people that can actually undertake that role. Section 5 on delegated authority. So we have touched on this in previous forums. There is quite a bit of change on the accounting standards landscape to do with leases and operating leases effectively being accounted for on the balance sheet of entities and trusts. So what they've actually brought in is, and to apply from the 1st of September 2024, is some simplification. So previously any finance leases needed pre-approval. They've now got a pre-approved list which you can access in 5.26 of the Trust Handbook. It allows you just to take out finance leases in a number of areas. So as an example, IT equipment, laptops, printers, photocopiers, temporary classrooms is on there as well, or equivalent structures, but not the actual land that the temporary classroom sits on. Anything to do with telephones, mobile phones, any telephone systems, and minibuses as well is another example. There's about 10 to perhaps a dozen sort of bullet points on that list, just if you want to refer to it before you do take out a finance lease. And section 6 looks at the regulator and intervention. So there's a couple of changes that have been brought in here. So it's 6.14. It sort of follows on from that first section on roles and responsibilities, and it's really changes that they've made to the cybersecurity standards, and really to reflect the fact that it's not just IT staff who need to be aware of these standards. You know, this is quite a high importance topic. So also the senior leadership team need to be able to apply the standards. So they've changed some of the wording, they've changed some of the format as well. So really it needs, as you know, as part of the review of the standards, just have a look at the cybersecurity standards as well. And lastly, at 6.16, they've now extended the situations in which they can issue a notice to improve. This is following on from previous trust handbooks where they were sort of placing an emphasis on estates management, and one of the areas that they've added is if the trust is failing to manage their school estate in a safe working condition. So one just to be mindful of, that they can issue a notice to improve in that circumstance. We do issue a fact sheet. As I said, the trust handbook came out 31st July, so we'd have issued a fact sheet soon after. If anybody wants a copy, either drop us a note and we're more than happy just to send that on. So moving on to accounting officer letters, just the final bullet point on this slide. So at the last forum, we reported that they were just delaying the trust handbook, which obviously did happen. That was just because of the general election that was announced on the 4th of July. So subsequently, we've had the handbook. And that was the second accounting officer's letter that came out 31st July from David Withy. And there was a note in there from him which really said that they've deliberately kept the number of changes to a minimum. They've had feedback that a greater stability would be welcomed at the current time, so that they've followed that feedback. And there's been one quite recent as well. So there was one issued on the 11th of September. And that is to announce that the ESFA, as a separate executive agency, will close on the 31st of March 2025. So its activities will be consumed within the DFE. The hope, again, the narrative was the hope that it will allow for a more cohesive regulatory interface and joined up delivery of services. I've got an Academy forum with auditors forum coming up at the end of this month. So David Withy is presenting at that forum. So if there's any feedback that we get from David at that forum, then we'll pass it on. So as I mentioned at the start, we do have our second poll of the day, very quick poll, not too technical. So the poll: have the recent ESFA letters to accounting officers been circulated to your board of trustees? So it's not a must, but it is a recommendation or a good practice really to do that. So yes, it's been circulated. No, or don't know. Just give that 10-15 more seconds just to make sure everyone's voted. Glad to see no one went with no, but yeah, so that's pretty pretty shared down the. Oh, some more votes coming in. Okay, so yes takes it. So so that's pleasing to see that they are being circulated to the board of trustees and to the CFOs as well. So that's good to see. Okay, that's it from me. So I'll pass you over to James, who's going to take you through internal scrutiny.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. By way of a quick introduction, I am James Flood, and like Michaela and Gary, I am an audit director here at HWB. So I'm looking forward to working closer with a lot of you over the next few months with your external audits. So internal scrutiny is an area where we are starting to see an increase in focus, and so I'd like to spend a bit of time today running through a bit of a refresher with you. I think it would be fair to say from our experience that we see a very wide-ranging degree of attention given to this area by academies and trusts that we work with. And there has also in the past been a certain level of leniency given in this area, perhaps where internal scrutiny hadn't been completed as robustly as it should have been, especially going back a couple of years, when we had COVID and we couldn't get people out to schools to do the work. All that being said, I think with the benefit of some new added guidance from the ESFA, which has set out their expectations in more detail, I think we should start to see a bit more consistency amongst schools moving forwards. So within this section, I'd like to briefly cover the areas set out on this slide. So starting with some ESFA feedback from 2023-24. A quick general update, although I think Gary has covered most of that for me. We will also look at how the scope of internal scrutiny should be defined, as well as the good practice guide that was released back in February 2024. And then finally, I will be just touching on the annual summary reports, which are due for submission at the end of this year. So we could go on to the next slide, please, Emma. Yeah, so on this first slide, I've just pulled out a few comments from the ESFA's feedback report from their review of 2023-2024 assurance work. And I think this really backs up what I said before, really, about there being a wide range of efforts going into internal scrutiny. This also refers to the fact that there were some external audit reports that included modifications in the regularity section last year, so where either internal scrutiny did not take place at all, or where the Audit and Risk Committee didn't agree the programme of work. So I assume this is where academies were simply just having basic annual financial checks rather than focusing their efforts on areas of risk. Another point they raised was that quite often they saw that recommendations from the previous year audits hadn't been implemented and remained unresolved. as well. So I think, obviously this feedback doesn't apply to everybody, but I think it just goes to show that perhaps there could be some improvement made in some cases. So we go on to the next slide, please. So just a general update really. So as Gary mentioned before, larger trusts can no longer use non-employed trustees or independent peer-to-peer reviews to cover their internal scrutiny work. And I think this is, that's fair given the additional complexity and risks that come with larger trusts. So, going forward, you will have to use bought-in services or an internal employed internal scrutineer. Just as a separate reminder, and I'm sure you're all aware of this already, but internal scrutiny must cover both financial and non-financial areas. It should focus on a programme of perceived risks, and it should also be overseen and analysed by the audit and risk committees rather than school business managers and CFOs. So moving over to the next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of defining the scope of internal scrutiny each year, this, as I mentioned, needs to be directed by the Audit and Risk Committee. They should use the Academy Trust Risk Register, which should be continually updated and reviewed to consider the areas of focus. And as I noted from the SFA feedback from 2022-23, internal scrutiny should also be used as an opportunity to follow up on weaknesses identified in the previous external and internal audits. And then regarding the risk register and selecting areas for review, I think just to mention that, just because you may have covered an area in 1 year, it doesn't mean that you can't then revisit it on a cycle if it's a genuine recurring risk, whatever it may be. So it really does depend on the ongoing risk assessments in terms of how you focus your efforts each year. So moving over to the next slide. Yeah, so the Audit and Risk Committee should be covering internal scrutiny at each meeting, reviewing the reports by the scrutineers and also agreeing a plan of action to address any points raised. In terms of a suggested timetable, I've set out a bit of an example on screen which might be of use. So, our suggestion would be that in January of each year or sooner if time allows, the Audit and Risk Committee should include a review of the risk register in their meeting and agree a programme of work for the coming year. The spring term can then be used to arrange the first internal scrutiny review, which should also include, a follow-up of points raised in the previous year, following which in summer you could have the second review take place. And then the autumn term should be used to write up the annual summary report, consider the effectiveness of both the programmes that took place in the year and the people that carried them out or carried out the reviews, and to start considering any risk areas to be covered in the next year. Obviously, the number of visits and the areas covered will very much depend on the size and complexity of your trust. So this is really just an indicator that may be useful. So we could go over to the next slide, please. So a really useful document that was released in February 2024 is the Internal Scrutiny Good Practice Guide. I'd very much recommend this being circulated amongst your Audit and Risk Committee members, if not already, as it will give them a good overview of the expectations that are placed on them. A couple of particularly useful parts to mention is a section that sets out the suggested frequency of the visits, as I think sometimes people are unsure of how often these should be happening. And even more so is a list of suggested areas for coverage, which includes governance, estates management, strategic and budgeting considerations, procurement. So really anything that would be considered a standard risk for academies. So moving on to the last slide here. So yes, just one final point. is a reminder that the annual summaries of internal scrutiny should be ready for submission by the 31st of December. Whilst the deadline for these is the end of the year, it would be very helpful for us to, as external auditors, to have a copy much sooner than the deadline, as it will help us to assess the adequacy of work completed in the year as part of our regularity review responsibilities. The good practice guide that I mentioned before has a really useful template for how the report should be set out as well. So for those of you that do produce your own annual summaries, I'd certainly refer you to that to have a look to see how they lay it out within that. Yeah, so hopefully that's a useful update and refresher on internal scrutiny. As I said at the start, really, it does seem that more focus has been given to this, especially in the last couple of years. So hopefully, more focus will be given to it internally. So yeah, thank you. I'll now be passing you over to Michaela to run through a governance update.
Lovely. Thank you very much, James. Just a quick reminder for everybody, if there are any questions, please do put them into the chat box and we will answer them as we proceed. So yes, this topic, governance. As from 7th of March this year, the Academy Trust Governance Handbook was withdrawn and the ESFA updated their governance guide instead, which is now your primary source to refer to. So what I've done is I've listed on this slide the new sections that have been added to the guide that was always there before, and I'd recommend that you review this to ensure that you're complying with the guidance that is relevant to your Academy Trust. After this meeting, we will obviously send you the link to the guidance in our follow-up email to help you. And do make your trustees aware of it because it is written for you in terms of the finance team and also for them. And the style of it is very much like the Academy Accounts Direction, and it lists musts and shoulds. And therefore, you have some guidance there as to, which areas to concentrate on first. In addition to that guidance, you may also have other governance expectations put on your Academy Trust. For instance, if you're a MAT, then the diocesan authority might put some other additional governance rules, or indeed your sponsor might as well. So do take a look at them and action anything that is seen as good practice, and document in your minutes that you and the boards have reviewed this new governance guide. So yeah, that was a very, very brief run through. So do look it up. So moving on through to the next slide on decarbonisation. I thought we should just take a look at this. It is sort of future planning, so no immediate rush to do anything. But there is this public sector decarbonisation scheme all around the school's site, your buildings. And the DfE have set out their net zero ambition, which is based on the UK government's legislation to meet net zero by 2050. So quite sort of grand expectations. And so I suppose at this stage, should be starting to see some sort of little steps within your Academy Trust. And we've always had this sort of green agenda, in the background, and Academy Trusts have been receiving Salex loans, which have been based on efficiencies and green use of energy for a little while now. But looking at the strategic aims that the DfE have set out, I'll just read through the sort of main headings. They want you as schools to prepare all young people for a world impacted by climate change. They want to see reduced direct and indirect emissions, and they want some sort of resilience to climate change, i.e. adapting your buildings and enhancing biodiversity and improving air quality. So I suppose my question to you all is, what are your board doing now? Have you developed your sustainability policy? Are the senior leadership team getting involved with that as well? And do you have a trustee who is an education lead? You have an education lead and also a trustee that leads on sustainability. Things that you need to think about are around your emissions. So scope 1 emissions need to be tackled first, and you need to be able to have those achievable plans that you're actively managing to get us to 2050. The big area is, of course, trying to weave it into your curriculum and trying to instill that green ethos, not only to your staff, but to students as well. So yeah, as I said, it's quite a way away, but something to start thinking about. So we've again initiated another poll. This is one where you can type in your answers as to what you've started to do already. So please do type away and we'll see what other people on this seminar are doing so far. Yeah, so the first comment there that's come up about having a trustee who's sort of tasked with helping you and the school as a whole, it's a real crossover between curriculum, finance and estates, really, in trying to come up with an overview plan that works for you. Can't see any other comments coming up at the moment, but yeah, something for the future. Very, very early, as I've said, but at least some have started thinking about it. So we'll move on to the next slide then, which was just a very brief reminder for you of the up and coming timelines that need to be complied with. So the first one is around the land and buildings collection tool. This has had very little focus on by the ESFA over the years, and no penalties for not filing on time. But we are now seeing the ESFA being more interested in this, and therefore this year as auditors we might spend more time reviewing this, as we've been made aware via the ESFA forum of some of the forms not being completed as the ESFA want them to be. And it's particularly a problem if you're a diocese school or a part of a diocese academy trust. So this form will go live on the 8th of October and needs submission by the 12th of November, and usually doesn't cause many of you any problems with the completion. Then we have the results of the external audits that many of you will be undertaking at this moment in time. So the accounts, the audit findings report or management letter, and the summary annual scrutiny report that James mentioned earlier all need to be filed with the ESFA by the 31st of December, which of course in practice means really needs to be filed at least by the last day of term when you break up in sort of near the end of December. Then following the new year, we've got the Academy's accounts return, which is set at the 18th of January. And then your financial statements need to be uploaded onto your website. That's usually done either in December or January, but that is the backstop date. We then have the Schools Resource Management Self-Assessment Tool, and at the moment there is no exact date for filing, but based on the filing date of that last year, we're estimating it to be the 14th of March. This is one where you need a little bit of input from your Board of Trustees, in order to be able to sign and submit that. The accounts filing deadline is the 31st of May, but in most cases, accounts are filed before the end of January by most of you. And then the final one, just to remind, is the budget forecast return. And again, this is an estimated date of the 31st of August. And again, that needs sign off by your Board of Trustees that they've considered the forecast that you've put together for them. So that's a very, very brief run through of the timetable. We've kept on time and I can't see any questions in the chat at the moment. So it just really leaves me to draw the session to a close and to say I hope today has been a good brief update of everything that's happening in the sector. I'd like to remind you that we issue monthly Academy newswires, and therefore if any of you aren't signed up for those already, please do let us have your email address and we'll make sure you receive those. We have set some dates for the 2025 forums. We've got the 11th of February, which will be online, and then we're going to run one in June, which will be in person in Totton, which is where we held our in-person one this year, and then one on the 18th of September, again online. We, as you know, put on an annual update for trustees, and this year we have set the date as the 11th of September, and all these events are on our website. So if any of you want to be very organised for 2025, you can go ahead and book those now. So just to say, we will send out the slides next week together with any documents we've mentioned and links to useful sites, and the recording will go up onto YouTube, and therefore you can send them on to anyone in your Academy Trust who couldn't make it today. So I hope the rest of the week is kind to you, and I look forward to seeing you in February, if not before. I'd just like to say thank you to all the HWB speakers, and of course to Lorraine Ashover from Minerva, who joined us right at the beginning. Thank you all, and have a good weekend.